Welcome, everyone, and we are glad this evening to welcome Andrew Bernstein. Andrew will discuss the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition, its origin and history, and the work it is undertaking in 2024 to advance voting rights in Delaware. Andrew joined the ACLU of Delaware in 2023 after graduating from the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. During his law school career, Andrew worked as a certified legal intern for the Civil Practice Clinic, working with indigent clients on a variety of matters, including landlord-tenant disputes and consumer debt cases. Andrew also worked as a certified legal intern in the Advocacy for Racial and Civil Justice Clinic, where he helped lead the clinic's education equity efforts. Andrew served as vice president of the Carey Law School's Democracy Law Project, where he began working closely with the ACLU of Delaware and other partners on voting rights protections. Andrew joins the ACLU of Delaware as a Cozen Voting Rights Fellow and will focus his efforts on pushing back against attacks on voting rights and advocating for reforms and improvements to expand access to the ballot for all voters. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me, for the lovely introduction. So as Lynn was saying, my name's Andrew and I'm with the ACLU of Delaware. I'm the Cozen Voting Rights Fellow, and that is kind of a ambiguous, confusing title, and my role is kind of a little ambiguous and confusing as well. As was said in my introduction, I went to law school, so I'm a lawyer by training, but I kind of approach my fellowship and my work with voting rights in Delaware from a multidisciplinary angle. So when necessary, I can litigate voting rights cases, but I also engage in community organizing, lobbying, legislative organizing, so on and so forth. So one of the hats that I wear at the ACLU of Delaware and my focus on voting rights is convening the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition, which is what I'm here to mostly talk about with y'all today. So the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition was publicly launched in April of 2021. At the time it was launched, it was Delaware's first statewide voting rights coalition, and it was launched comprised of more than 36 diverse organizations. It has since then grown. The stated purpose of the DVRC is to identify and remedy barriers to the ballot box, especially when they prohibit vulnerable and historically disenfranchised voters from casting ballots. So at the time of the DVRC's founding, some of the priorities were advocating for no excuse absentee voting, expanded vote by mail, and same-day registration. There is a long history that I'm sure folks are aware of when it comes to those topics in Delaware, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, there was legislative advocacy in 2021 for the second leg of a constitutional amendment to allow no excuse absentee voting that did not succeed due to supermajority requirements and changing political headwinds. But following that year, the DVRC successfully advocated for a law to allow universal vote by mail and same-day registration in 2022. Unfortunately, those laws were later ruled unconstitutional by the Delaware Supreme Court. That was actually where I entered the picture with DVRC while I was still in law school and at the still at law school and at the Democracy Law Project at Penn. I partnered with the ACLU to work on the amicus brief that we submitted, trying to get the laws to be upheld when it went in front of the state Supreme Court. So that my experience with DVRC goes back to there, and that's how I started becoming involved in Delaware. But regardless of that outcome, the DVRC remains committed to advocating for those reforms of same-day registration and vote by mail. Yes, Lynn?
You okay making it informal? Can we ask questions as you go along?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm totally happy with people.
All right, just because I'm sure I'll forget by the time you get to the end of the presentation. In terms of that constitutional amendment piece, isn't it true that the first time that it went through, both parties were fully in support of it and it had Republican support and they thought it was a great idea? And it was when it came around the second time, political winds had changed and all of a sudden they didn't think the same thing was such a good idea?
Yep, that's what happened. So I'm sure everyone here is aware of the about face that happened nationally and locally with vote by mail. when it comes to one of the major political parties. So that there was bipartisan support for it when it passed its first leg, and then when its second leg failed, it was because of that change in the headwinds. Yeah, that's what happened there. And also anyone else, like totally happy to answer questions as this goes along. Um, so I'll just mention some of the other legislative priorities that the DVRC has worked on over the years. We've advocated for fairer redistricting. We've advocated against the ability of corporate and other artificial entities to vote in municipal elections, which is something that I think surprises a lot of folks when they learn that's an issue that has to be contended with. And we've also advocated for a constitutional amendment to end permanent felony disenfranchisement in Delaware, which the intersection of the criminal justice system and voting is a particular interest of mine and something that my fellowship is particularly involved in. But outside of the legislative arena, the DVRC and its members have worked diligently to ensure the ballot is accessible to voters with disabilities. DVRC and its members have investigated barriers and presented testimony to the Department of Elections to point out accessibility violations. I can go into this a little bit more later and what's currently going on with that. But DVRC members are currently in conversation with the department about these matters. DVRC has also frequently engaged in voter registration and engagement efforts, and we're going to continue to do that work. In 2023, a main focus of the DVRC was school board elections. We were able to create resources educating voters about how and why to vote in school board elections. The last thing is I mentioned lawyer by training. So another thing the DVRC does is that sometimes its members end up in court. I already mentioned the amicus brief that was filed to support no excuse vote by mail and same-day registration. But currently, the ACLU of Delaware is engaged in a lawsuit to ensure that eligible incarcerated voters have access to a constitutional means of voting. So that's kind of broadly what the kind of like a short history. If people have questions about that, happy to answer, but I can also just transition to talking a little bit about what we're working on in 2024. So just transitioning to that then, we were involved with already having happened towards the end of 2023, we were involved with getting voter information out for the special election that happened right before 2024 in RD 37, if I'm remembering the number correctly. We helped put information about how to vote, where to go to vote, registration deadline, so on and so forth on votedelaware.com, which is one of our resources that we use to get information out to voters. Our site was visited over 1,000 times, over 4,000 times by over 1,000 unique people. So that was great, and we're going to hope to continue to post that kind of information on there and have a robust effort around the statewide elections in 2024. One I already mentioned, we have a lawsuit regarding eligible incarcerated voters. So this one's kind of a long-winding story, but if everyone will bear with me, in Delaware, you retain your right to vote as long as you are not convicted of a felony or previously convicted of a permanently disenfranchising felony. So if you are on pretrial detention awaiting your hearing, or if you have solely been convicted of a misdemeanor and are incarcerated, you retain your right to vote, broadly speaking. So an issue that we noticed immediately after the Delaware Supreme Court's decision regarding no excuse absentee voting is that the Delaware Supreme Court said that the list of reasons given in the Delaware Constitution to vote absentee are exhaustive. So if you go through that list, you'll notice that being incarcerated is not listed as a reason that someone can apply for and cast an absentee ballot. So the Department of Corrections, Department of Elections only offer these voters that method of voting. So the ACLU of Delaware tried to work with the departments to address this issue to no avail. So we ended up with a lawsuit against them. We're collaborating with the Voting Rights Project, with National ACLU, and a few law firms to bring this lawsuit. Our first hearing is scheduled for April 19th. And the goal of the lawsuit, broadly speaking, is to ensure that these voters have access to a constitutional means of casting a ballot, so they aren't offered a mechanism for voting that could be challenged or have their right to vote chilled by receiving conflicting guidance as to their ability to cast a ballot. So that's kind of a little bit of a long and winding story. But if anyone has any questions, happy to answer them. But that's where we are right now with that lawsuit. Yeah.
How many? Oh, sorry. Is Delaware unique in this or how many states have that same kind of requirement or I guess I'm asking is am I muted?
No, you're not muted. Unique.
Right.
I can take that question a few different ways. So I'm just to make sure everyone's on the same page, I'll answer it a few different ways. And I'm actually, that's a great segue for me to share my screen and show a map to folks. Bear with me while I figure out technology. Is my screen being shared? And do folks see a map now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is looking at felony disenfranchisement. So this map is showing us where can folks be denied the right to vote based permanently based on a felony conviction. So we have some people, so just taking broadly the question of felony disenfranchisement, if you look at Delaware, Delaware is a little bit of a regional outlier. So a lot of states in the Northeast have disenfranchisement while someone is in prison, but not disenfranchisement after. And these are felony convictions. So that's just kind of broadly talking about felony disenfranchisement. I'm gonna stop sharing now because it's a little bit more distracting for me. But when it comes to voting while incarcerated, there is no state, to my knowledge, that takes away the right to vote to anyone who does not, that is on pretrial detention, that has not been convicted of any crime yet. The right to vote still exists. Most places do offer, to my knowledge, some sort of remote voting method, although there are increasing numbers of jurisdictions that do have in-person voting options for eligible incarcerated voters. For example, Cook County Jail in Chicago has in-person polling facilities, and they have had voter turnout rates within the facilities that surpass those of the surrounding communities. So it is something that people that once it is offered, it's something that really takes off from the evidence that we do have, which we would hope for in Delaware as well, as to the best of our knowledge, 0 people voted from Delaware facilities, 0 eligible voters. So, you have plenty of eligible voters, but 0 were able to successfully cast a ballot in 2020, and only 3 were able to successfully cast ballots in 2022. So even before we had the issue of, is this method of voting constitutional, we had the additional problem of, are people really being made aware of their rights? How difficult is it for them to cast a ballot? And from my understanding, speaking to folks who work in jurisdictions that have not in-person options, but remote options, our numbers are low, even for places that have those remote options. So I hope I answered the question. I think I might have detoured and segued a little bit, but if I didn't, let me know. But otherwise, I think someone else has their hand up.
So Andrew, I just wanted to say thank you. I am very active with the League of Women Voters, and we work closely with your group and are appalled by this situation in Delaware. So thank you for your legal efforts, and we'll be looking to see what happens in April, because this is not only an issue about voting, it's an issue about where these people are counted for where they live. And that has been an issue, a contentious issue going forward too.
Mhm. Yeah, I believe prison gerrymandering, that's like a huge issue. It's not directly like necessarily addressed in our lawsuit, but I mean, having the right to vote and having a meaningful right to vote with a lawful mechanism for casting a ballot is an important step there. And I would also say that you made me think of the fact that once this is like assuming we get the kind of outcome that we're looking for, we know that there might be a need for folks at organizations to volunteer to go in and inform people their rights and let them know about candidates and, you know, to do the kind of voter education and engagement work to really drive up participation. So just the league made me think of that. So
And
thank
that's another issue too, because we've tried to be in the prisons and it's very difficult to have a presence there.
Yeah, it is very difficult to get the Delaware Department of Corrections to allow outsiders in, and there are a lot of preconceived notions people have about safety, about improper influence over voters casting a ballot if outsiders come in and inform them about elections. But from my conversations, I mentioned Chicago, but Colorado is another state with some jurisdictions that have kind of robust prison voting programs, and they have. I've talked to them frequently about how they don't really have any sort of special safety concerns. They haven't really had any major incidents, and how the voters are just so engaged and sometimes know more than the people that they're talking to. So the improper influence thing is also a little bit of an overblown concern there. So yeah, any other questions about that lawsuit? Yes, Maria, I believe.
Andrew, sorry, it's not about the lawsuit, but again, the right to vote is an amendment right, correct? But it's defined by each state, correct?
I would say like the right to vote, I think it's and you could have a lot of constitutional debate about where exactly in the federal constitution it is housed, but it is in there guarded by a plethora of amendments, I would say. And then yes, states do some work regarding how that right is realized.
So it appears to me that this Scrabble amount of letters that each state is playing with. And basically, we all know that what's happening is a disenfranchisement at many levels. Some of it is racial, some of it is incarceration, but basically it's taking away people's right to vote, because voting is very important in terms of the people that we elect. People that we elect to represent at least what we're thinking about. We don't have the right to do that. Is there something that needs to happen at the federal level? Is this part of the John Lewis bill that we need?
That's a really great question. I think I am not the foremost expert on the John Lewis bill, so I'm not going to say anything to definitively on that. I will say that there is talk, like I said, because the right to vote is kind of this right in the Constitution, like in the Constitution, but not explicitly spelled out anywhere in the Constitution. I know that there is talk among scholars about introducing a formal amendment codifying the right to vote in the Constitution. So I think that's something that, but it's something that could potentially solve a lot of problems, but also seems politically very far away from happening in terms of where we are right now. When you bring up things like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that is just an act that needs a bare majority, that doesn't seem to have all that much in terms of legs right now with where things currently are. So I will say, yeah, I think that there is a larger project of disenfranchisement that a bold national legislation could do a good deal to combat. But in terms of, if you do it legislatively, you currently have both a political climate and, frankly, a Supreme Court that would be potentially hostile to it. And to do it by amendment, it seems like a daunting task. Not to be too much of a downer.
Well, personally, I think the Supreme Court is not in this bucket. That seems to be, they need to speak about laws that are passed that they may argue with. But if there was laws passed, they can argue about that. But they can't make laws yet. Thank goodness.
Right. And sorry if I was being if I was burying the lead there. I was speaking more to how they might interpret such a law if it were passed. And how,
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, of course. If there are no more questions about the prison voting lawsuit, I'll keep talking about. Oh, yes, Moira.
Andrew, what do you see as the prospects for a no excuse absentee voting in the current General Assembly and the next one?
This is a $1 million question. It's one I talk to folks who have a lot of different opinions on it. I'd say I'm personally probably more pessimistic than optimistic at this point in time. I'm still at the point where I could be convinced, and I have heard from some folks that they think it could happen. So I would really hope that we can build some momentum there and maybe get something this legislative session. And quite frankly, even if it were something that were brought just to force people to take another vote on it, knowing it might not pass, to get folks on the record to really be able to demonstrate and have a record of who is a voting rights champion and who is not in the legislature, just so people know when they go to the polls where their representatives stand. Even if it's something like that, I think that would be good for the long-term prospects legislation, because I do think based on polling that voting by mail is a winning issue. And we know when folks are able to go out and vote and know where the candidates stand on winning issues, that we can effectuate the kind of change we want long term.
If no excuse absentee voting is the Constitution is amended to allow that, does that mean we don't need to think at all about a separate vote by mail bill?
I think it would depend on the exact contours of what goes into a no excuse versus a vote by mail. I think it's there are definitely some considerations with regard to for example, I'm thinking about the prison voting context again, making sure that voters in unique contexts like that legislators might not be thinking about frequently are accounted for in whatever gets brought forward.
Okay. And one last question. Do you mind repeating your website? I didn't know you had one. Oh,
I actually, I don't know. I mean, there is a DVRC website that I could direct folks to.
That's the one, I'm sorry, that's the one I meant, that you said there were so many views of it in the RD 37 election.
Oh, yes, that's Vote Delaware. So I can actually put a link to Vote Delaware in the chat.
Thanks.
There's not much on it because this is updated during election season for candidate information and registration deadlines and so on and so forth to help people get engaged around election time. So there's not much on it right now, but it's something that we're really proud of around election time. We got a lot of great information on there and a lot of folks to view it. While I'm putting things in the chat, I'm going to put my email in the chat because we're always looking to grow the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition, and the fastest way to join it is to just email me because I'm the owner of the list. So if people are interested in joining after what you hear today, just feel free to shoot an email and I'll be sure to add you to the list because we meet bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. on Zoom. So happy to have folks there. Any other questions I could jump into another topic or we could keep talking about
I think
this?
we should let you continue. Sorry for derailing us and getting us
Oh,
all
no.
asking questions.
I have,
I love
this
this. Oh,
this
yeah.
is Sheridan Kingsbury. On my way home tonight, I heard on NPR that the Republican Party is looking to enter the fray of voting by mail. So if that is true, because there are a couple of I forgot who it was, but I was driving, so I couldn't take notes. But if that happens and the Republican Party starts looking at voting by mail, it might make our bill easier to get in the legislature because, it won't be looked at as a Democratic thing because now they're realizing that if you can early voting, and voting by mail early would help the other party, then maybe we won't have a problem getting our bill passed. I don't know if anybody has heard the story today.
I have not had time to hear that story today. I mean, I would totally welcome, any party, any politician who, has good intentions and a desire to work on that kind of legislation to come forward and engage with organizations like the DVRC and the ACLU to get a good amendment through, to work on something like that. I think that the just knowing polling, for example, on where generally conservative voters stand on vote by mail, I don't think it's something that very many Republican conservative politicians are likely to engage on. But to the extent, we're not opposed to working with folks if there's a compromise to be had.
But Sheridan, if I understand you correctly, the takeaway from what you listened to today was that those political winds are shifting is the good news that sounds like was coming out of that story, that they're kind of shifting back again to thinking, okay, maybe it is good.
Yeah, they think, well, it worked, so maybe it can work for us because they didn't have it and they lost, so now they needed to do it so they can win. So I mean, it's not altruistic, but either way, we have to look at where we can get a win. So
Yeah, I think there's a similar thing that
if I
happened.
find the story, I'll drop it in. I'll look for the story and see if I can drop it for you.
Yeah, appreciate that. I think there was a similar story with conservative voters and early voting because I believe I saw a story maybe a month or so ago that conservative leaders were looking to engage their party to use early voting more, and that it's becoming more of a national thing when early voting was a method of voting that was villainized for a few years. So it is possible. I think more of a kerfuffle was made about vote by mail, especially during the pandemic, by certain elected officials with very broad name recognition that made it pretty made it anathema for certain voters to use that method of voting. But to the extent that headwinds could change, I'd totally welcome that. Let's see, I'm sorry, I cannot read your name because the way my screen is, but I know,
Marge.
so, Marge, sorry about that. Your name is cut off on my screen.
Right. I think it's important to note too that in Delaware, even if you have the ability to do absentee ballot, if you've already been approved for that, it doesn't apply to school boards. So we have a lot of referendum coming up in Newcastle County. People that think they can vote absentee for that have to apply again for the ability to do that, to vote in a school board referendum. It's very confusing in Delaware, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I was I'm originally from Pennsylvania, so hearing about that was definitely there's been a lot of moments that were surprising to me coming from Pennsylvania, where I thought I would maybe have the tougher voting laws in my state coming to work here and kind of learning more as I've been working about some unique realities in Delaware. In fact, when I work in a lot of coalitions with folks from all over the country, and I'll tell them something about Delaware, and they'll be like, "Really, Delaware? Are you kidding? Like, I'm from X state, and it's much better where I am, and I would have never guessed that." So it's something that I think is surprising to a lot of folks, was surprising to me, and you're right, it can be complicated. I guess sticking with the general topic of criminal legal system and voting.
Andrew, if I could just interject for a minute. It says that there is a whole separate application process for absentee ballots for school board elections. So it is a totally separate process and they do not overlap. And if you have one, you do not have the other unless you've gone through both application processes, just for info.
Right. Apologies. Thank you for the clarification. So with like transitioning to kind of a related topic with criminal justice and voting, talking a little bit about now squarely focusing on felony disenfranchisement. So I kind of briefly touched on felony disenfranchisement in Delaware before, but I'm gonna share my screen again now and show a little bit about how felony disenfranchisement works in Delaware. So you can look at this and see, wow, it's very complicated to figure out if I'm eligible to vote in Delaware if I have any sort of interaction with the criminal legal system. So the easy thing is if you've never been convicted of a felony, you don't need to worry. So convicted of a felony, no, you are eligible to vote. I mentioned before that Delaware has permanently disenfranchising felonies, and that from the map I showed you all before, we are the only state in that northeast region. I used to say north of the Mason-Dixon line before someone corrected me and said Delaware isn't technically north of the Mason-Dixon line, but we're the only state in that northeast region that has at least some permanent felony disenfranchisement. So someone who has previously committed murder or manslaughter, not including vehicular manslaughter, a felony constituting an offense against public administration, so something like bribery or improper influence, abuse of office, things like that, or a felony constituting a sexual offense. Anyone who commits any of those kinds of felonies will not be eligible to vote ever again. They can apply for a pardon, but without a pardon, without seeking one, they will never be able to cast a ballot again. If you did not commit one of those felonies, you committed any other type of felony, if you are currently incarcerated, if you are on parole, probation, early release, work release, supervised custody, anything where the state is still controlling, there's some sort of aspect, you're maybe not formally incarcerated, but there's still some sort of degree of coercion there, you are still disenfranchised. you will not be eligible to vote until you complete your entire sentence, which includes those kind of auxiliary portions that I mentioned. If you are not, if you are not currently incarcerated and not on probation, parole, work release, anything like that, you are eligible to vote. Your voting rights are automatically restored. So that's kind of the landscape with felony disenfranchisement in Delaware. Oh, and I should point out, those things I mentioned before of probation, early release, work release, that does not include payment of fines or fees. So if you completed your incarceration, you don't have any like auxiliary thing remaining, and you have not paid off your fines and fees, you can vote. That is not an impediment. So that's kind of the simple version of this, believe it or not. But that's the kind of complicated regime we have in Delaware, and it inspires all sorts, and I'm going to stop sharing just so I can focus on people again. It inspires all sorts of problems, having that kind of complicated system. For example, there's a lot of confusion as to getting voting rights back. There's misconceptions regarding anyone who commits a felony is permanently disenfranchised. There's the issue of the state not register, not like helping folks know that they have a right to vote. The right to vote was restored once they're done with their sentence, as long as they don't have a permanently disenfranchising felony. And then kind of like a third problem we have just from a monitoring standpoint is it's hard to determine the exact impacts of felony disenfranchisement in Delaware, because one of the impact could be greater because the complicated system leads to people being confused about their rights. But two, when you permanently disenfranchise folks, and the state doesn't necessarily keep track of how many people are alive who have this kind of permanently disenfranchising felony, it can be hard to actually measure the impact. So one thing that DVRC is working on is supporting SB 180. SB 180 being a proposed constitutional amendment that is being currently considered, was brought towards the end of last legislative session and will be brought again this session. And it simplifies it to have us be more in line with those other Northeast states I was showing on the map before, who only disenfranchise folks during actual periods of incarceration for felony convictions. It also updates the Constitution to be in line with the federal Constitution when it comes to certain voting requirements, such as getting rid in the Delaware state Constitution of a literacy requirement that still exists in the Delaware Constitution somehow, even though it's unenforceable. So Senator Gay, one of the sponsors of that legislation, came to speak to the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition on the 2nd. And I know she's speaking to other groups about that legislation recently and also going forward. So that is another thing that the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition is focused on in 2024. And I feel like a natural question that might come up is, well, you just told me the voting rights, the vote by mail constitutional amendment, you don't feel necessarily particularly confident about that. Why are you talking to me about a felony disenfranchisement constitutional amendment? And I think from what I've heard both anecdotally about how to present these kinds of issues to be persuasive, framing felony disenfranchisement as being a criminal justice reform bill more so than a voting rights bill can lead to it having a little bit more legs in a legislature that might not typically be conducive to achieving a supermajority on voting rights. And then additionally, I've seen polling that also suggests that ending permanent felony disenfranchisement is more popular among conservative voters than instituting no excuse vote by mail. So that's another thing that DVRC will be focused on in 2024, and I'm happy to answer any questions folks have about that. Yes, Moira or Lynn.
Oh, Lynn, go ahead.
No, Moira, you go first, please.
I think this is pretty quick one. If somebody is permanently disenfranchised in Delaware under the current scheme, and they move to a state where under the rules of that state, they would not be disenfranchised, do they carry the Delaware disenfranchisement with them? Or are their voting rights defined by the laws of the state that they move to?
I believe it would be the latter. I would need to double check that just to be entirely certain. I don't want to say something incorrect on that, but
Okay.
I believe it would be the latter.
I believe that is the case because each state defines the voting laws for the residents of their state. And so any proscription against voting from another state would not carry forward.
That makes sense, and it's certainly the way it ought to be. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So I was just going to see, I know you talked about the sort of the priorities for the coalition going forward, but there are some other activities of people within the coalition as well, like ranked choice voting is one of the things that is also being worked on by folks that go to the coalition meetings. And although it's related to some of the stuff you already talked about in terms of getting people registered and all that, you know, Becca is now forming the group to do a real get out the vote thing. So there are definitely other pockets of activity around voting that fall within the umbrella of the coalition as well, right?
Correct. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time talking about some of the criminal justice oriented stuff, but yes, you mentioned Becca Cotto's Get Out the Vote coalition that she's forming. If folks are, I think that's in its early stages right now, and she's still trying to engage folks to get more people involved. If people are interested in joining Get Out the Vote coalition, reach out to me and I can connect people to Becca if they aren't already connected. But that's definitely something we're going to be working on. Another thing this is both a priority of the DVRC and something that I haven't been able to talk about yet, and that certain members in DVRC are taking the lead on is accessibility. So for the person and the organization that's taking the lead on accessibility in the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition right now is Joanne Kingsley with Community Legal Aid Society. So they came out with a great report, and I'm going to share my screen again. Moment. And I'm going to link people to this report too, because it's great. So they created this report on physical accessibility of polling locations, where they went out and took a look at polling places and determined that Delaware is in a sorry state when it comes to the accessibility of physical polling locations for people with disabilities. They just created, they had an abundance of examples of issues that they spotted with physical polling locations. Their main takeaways, there were issues with voting equipment, voting locations, and voting experience. With kind of the larger takeaways that I've been passed along to me being something as seemingly simple as parking, with ADA violations when it comes to parking designations that have been put in place. And then also things like not recruiting enough poll workers with disabilities who can really help voters who have these issues to navigate these systems. So this report was really important. I encourage folks who haven't had a chance to read it yet to read it, and I'm going to link it in the chat right now. But this report and classy, and Joanne's advocacy around it really did lead to some really positive momentum that we've been able to build. So they're currently in discussion with Commissioner Albence and county directors they went page by page over this report to talk about all the different issues that they were able to spot. And my understanding is that they've been having very productive meetings to the point where polling places are going to be changed in light of what's been put out in here. We currently have that representation, although we don't have a publicly available list of new polling places. So I know one thing that we're going to be working on once that publicly available list of polling places comes out is if there are a lot of new polling places, if they've made the changes that were pointed out to them, that we're going to need folks up and down the state to go out to those polling places and check to see if they're now compliant. And I know Joanne is working on ramping up kind of training and getting folks able to do that kind of work. So that's very exciting. Also on the accessibility front, just very quickly mention that if folks are like me and on the Department of Elections website frequently, you might notice that it has changed recently, ostensibly to make it more accessible. And while it might be more accessible, we're still currently in the process of evaluating the website for compliance. So something that actually would be very helpful for us to hear from folks is if folks who have any disability have had a chance to interact with the website yet and have any feedback. I know Joanne and myself would be really interested in hearing about that and seeing what issues, what experiences people are having with it. So that's, oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot one thing about the changes to polling places. Because we don't have that list of new polling places yet, and we're not sure exactly how many are going to be changed and how they're going to be changed. One thing that we're just going to keep in mind and want to be focused on is when the polling places get changed, voters will get new cards explaining that to them. But just in terms of kind of potentially being in an environment where more polling places have changed than have changed in recent years, and potentially having more confused voters as to where to go to cast a ballot will be something that we'll have to keep our eyes on. It's very important that the polling places are accessible. So it's good if a lot of polling places change to meet that end, but we'll just have to be ready to meet the bell and make sure that people know where they're actually supposed to vote in that world. So that's another kind of effort, priority of DVRC, but kind of being spearheaded by our accessibility committee and Joanne that I thought folks might like to hear about. Do people have any questions about that?
Are people going to be notified by mail of these changing voting sites?
Yes, they'll receive a card in the mail. I just it's something I think that it's helpful to get the information in the mail. I just think making sure people know what resources they can go to double check their polling place if they lose that piece of mail, so on and so forth. The extra reminders and work by groups such as the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition will be, I think, instrumental to making sure that those changes aren't too disruptive. Yes, Maura.
Krista Griffith was she's a rep in RD12 in the State House. She was the prime sponsor on a bill where she worked very closely with the Department of Elections to change from the card that we're all used to getting in like a postcard. We're now going to get a full letter, and it's going to have expanded information about not just your polling location, but information about the early voting, the dates and the locations, and other things related to voting. It was one of her primary efforts in last year's General Assembly, and I don't know if it passed unanimously, but it did have pretty broad support. And I know she was talking to the Department of Elections about extending that approach to school board elections, which would be wonderful because the turnout is, typically single digit level in school board elections. So we will all be getting this letter and we can all thank Representative Griffith.
Thank you, Moira. Any other questions?
I have a question about accessibility because in rural communities, are they gonna be, is that being considered as well? Having enough polling places in rural communities, especially down in Sussex County?
Yeah, I think I don't, in terms of what the accessibility committee at DVRC is currently working on, I don't think that's been necessarily a primary focus right now, is expanding the number of polling places. It has been something that, as we've kind of been in a little bit of a reorganization of priorities in DVRC right now, that is something we've been hearing from folks. So I do think it is something that will be something that we advocate for going forward. Because it is an issue, like the polling place to distance to get somewhere, if there's long lines, if there aren't enough polling places. So I think that's something that is also important, and is also, it's great to have the polling places someone can get into, but it's also an accessibility issue if you can't get in and out of there quickly from your home, or from like from the door of your car to getting back to your car. If there are no other questions like that, I'm just going to very, very quickly mention one more thing if I have time to. Another thing that we just have our eye on at DVRC is that there is currently a lawsuit challenging early voting and permanent absentee voting status in Delaware. So this case is kind of a similar-ish case to the case that challenged no excuse vote by mail and same-day registration. So this lawsuit, it's currently winding its way through the courts. It's currently in Superior Court in Delaware, so one step below the Delaware Supreme Court. Oral argument was supposed to be on January 10th, but it was canceled due to one of the attorneys getting sick. A new date has yet to be announced, but I've been trying to keep the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition in trying to keep them in the loop there. I mean, when it comes to permanent absentee voting designation, and just to make sure folks are on the same page, that's a status you can apply for, wherein if it gets granted, you automatically get an absentee ballot at each election, as opposed to having to apply for one every time there's a new election. And it applies only to certain voters who are eligible to cast an absentee ballot in general. For example, included on that are voters with physical disabilities. But in terms of the number of people it could impact, there are over 20,000 voters on the permanent absentee voting list. And it's been around for over a decade at this point. So we have a lot of people who've been on that list potentially for a very long time, who would face certainly a lot of confusion and difficulty if they suddenly had to learn how to reapply for an absentee ballot, or realize very late in the day that they now have to apply for an absentee ballot, especially because that permanent absentee distinction was put in place after the legislature determined that certain voters just have difficulty submitting that application. And then when it comes to early voting, which hasn't been around for as long, but it's already gotten to the place where over 50,000 voters used it in 2022. So this is, the tracking that lawsuit, and potentially, at least from the ACLU of Delaware standpoint, seeking to file another brief, trying to persuade the court that a disruption in those laws is not required by the Delaware Constitution, or carrying the purpose of the Delaware Constitution when it comes to advancing democracy, is something that DVRC and ACLU of Delaware is in particular focused on. Do I see, is that a hand?
Yeah, Nancy?
Or I think you're muted.
Need the glasses to get unmuted. I feel you.
I got it. Okay. In the lawsuit, now was the challenge, was it specified that then they're wanting these people to reapply yearly, or did it specify, or they're just challenging it in general, the permanent absentee ballots?
Yeah,
I'm
it's challenging.
Here, what the lawsuit is.
I'm sorry, I started talking too early. Could you repeat the second part of your question?
I'm not clear what the lawsuit, they're just challenging it in general, or they're saying specifically that that people with disabilities or permanent absentee ballots would need to apply yearly, or did it specify how often, or every election?
So the lawsuit seeks just a total invalidation of permanent absentee voting status. So it's not for any particular category of voter who currently is allowed to vote by permanent absentee, who's currently allowed to apply for permanent absentee status. It would just get rid of that status entirely. So instead of being kind of like instead of allowing for subgroups of people who could vote by absentee ballot to not have to apply for their ballots every election, this change would make it so every voter who is specified in the Delaware Constitution as being able to cast an absentee ballot needs to send in a new application at each election for such ballot. Does that make sense? Was that?
It does. Not very convenient. Yeah.
I know we are already at 8 o'clock. We don't like to run too far over, but do you want to say something very briefly about ranked choice voting? Only because a topic that was discussed at a Thursday night not too long ago on high conflict versus good conflict, actually use that as an example of where getting away from just this dual, our two-party thing and only being able to vote for one or the other and being able to do a ranked choice could actually be a good thing for the country. Can you talk a little bit about DVRC's role in that?
Yeah, DVRC also has a ranked choice voting committee. I think the focus currently when it comes to ranked choice voting is kind of seeing if it can get implemented at non-statewide elections, at least to start, or at least kind of like more of your municipal or local elections as kind of a proof of concept. So that is, I agree also that like from the benefit, that there is the benefit with ranked choice voting of potentially cooling down the temperature and leading to less stark partisanship when it comes to that. So there's definitely a benefit there. I think where there's people are asking for a proof of concept is there's certainly a little bit of ongoing debate about whether ranked choice voting confuses voters and leads to folks being less likely to cast a ballot. So I know there is some ongoing scholarly debate there about whether ranked choice voting has any impact there. I don't think that the jury is fully out on it, but it does definitely have the proven benefit of giving voters more options, which in turn usually leads to more moderated outcomes that reduce partisanship.
So before we completely close out, I will repeat part of what Andrew said, and I remind folks that anyone can be part of this voting rights coalition. Again, Andrew put his email in the chat. You can email him to be added to the distribution list, even if you can't make it to meetings that frequently. Andrew does a great job of publishing the minutes from the meetings and stuff, so you can stay up to date on what's happening, what's going on, if you want to. So they meet every other week. It's a really robust, good discussion at the meetings. And although I do jump in and attend meetings periodically, I'm not an every meeting attendee. And even though I'd like to say I have been representing our Peace and Justice Work Group, I have not been taking the time to report back out to the Peace and Justice Work Group what I learned there. So I'm not really a very good liaison. So this is my request to anyone here, or if you know anyone else in our Peace and Justice Work Group who isn't here tonight, who would like to be said liaison. I think it would be great if we could get someone who would regularly attend those meetings and then further cascade relevant information, particularly when there's a call to action back out to the rest of the Peace and Justice Work Group. So that's my request to the group. Any
And there will be plenty of
volunteers?
calls to action in 2024. Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for having me. I really enjoyed talking to folks. I can stick around a little bit longer if folks have additional questions, but I also know I don't want people to just have to feel like they have to stay on as it is a little late at this point.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for being here and sharing this with us tonight. We really appreciate your efforts. And Maura, yours as well with Indivisibles. And many of us have been involved in voting rights and voter turnout initiatives. I am expecting and hopeful that we will be very active in the course of 2024 to ensure that we get out the vote. And I would just conclude with a little bit of philosophy, perhaps, because Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that governments are instituted among men. I'm sure he meant to include women and just slipped his mind, but governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And in our system, that consent is given by way of the vote. And so it is instructive to ask what ought be the role of government: to facilitate voting or to constrain voting. And it would seem quite clear that the answer to that is the former. The role of government should be to facilitate government voting so that we are all able to give our consent as described in the Declaration of Independence. So thank you for your work, Andrew, and thank you for taking time to be here with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for concluding far more elegantly than I could have. That was, thank you.
And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Good night,
Right.
everybody. Thank you,
Thanks. Good
Ingrid.
night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.